So Sergey Karjakin, our fifth candidate that we've covered. Let's see, yeah, fifth candidate out of 8. As you'll recall, you guys know who we are. As you'll recall, Topalov, Karjakin, I showed this exact same slide in the Spidler lecture. He qualified because he won the Chess World Cup in October. So with that win, he qualified for the candidates tournament, beat Peter Spidler in kind of a nail-biter of a final, a little bit of a sloppy series, but Karjakin was able to grind out a win there. So last time we met, I told you that we didn't really have any updates on the candidates tournament itself. We didn't know where it was going to be, when it was going to be. We didn't know who the organizer's nominee was. We had a lot of speculation about it. Well, speculate no longer. We know that the tournament is going to be in Moscow. It's going to occur in March, like March 8th through the 30th, 10th through the 30th, 2016. We know that Levon Aronian is going to be the candidate's nominee. And the chess world was actually not surprised by this development. Levon Aronian, for those of you following chess, has had a pretty good year. His rating doesn't put him in the top 5 right now, but the quality of his play might. He's been playing some really good chess recently. So when the announcement was made, a lot of chess professionals took to Twitter and they talked about how they weren't surprised that Aronian was the organizer's nominee, but they were surprised, somewhat anyway, that the tournament was going to be held in Moscow. It's going to be in Moscow, and the reason that it's going to be in Moscow is because the Russian Chess Federation, along with a Russian company named Tashir, decided to put up the money to pay for the tournament. Now, it's not really surprising when you consider the company itself. Tashir is a building and construction company, and the CEO of the company, the founder and CEO, Sergey Karjakin, you might recognize that name as an Armenian name, and he grew up in Armenia. You can see he graduated from a Yerevan Polytechnic Institute, and you'll see in the announcement above that the FIDE president went to visit in Yerevan as well, where he met the president of Armenia, the president of the Armenian Chess Federation, etc. So Karjakin is also known for sponsoring the 2014 Petrosian Memorial Tournament. Petrosian, perhaps the most famous Armenian chess player, with Aronian in close second. So he puts up the money, and you see it doesn't make a dent in his net worth. And so the tournament's going to be held in Moscow. Aronian's going to be the organizer's nominee. So it appears that the field is set. Giri, Caruana, Nakamura, Spidler, Karjakin, Topalov, Giri, and Aronian. In fact, FIDE has announced that on their website. They say that this is the field. However, there is not 100% certainty around this for 2 reasons. One, the average rating for the year between Anish Giri and Vladimir Kramnik is actually very, very close. Mathematically speaking, Kramnik will probably not be able to overtake Giri in his monthly average, but it's very close. If this were to go out if they were to consider, say, the January ratings and the February ratings, and the ratings of both players stay the same right now, Kramnik has a much higher rating, Kramnik would get in, and Giri would not. But at the moment, it looks, in all likelihood, that Giri and Topalov will get in on rating. There is a small chance Giri will not get in on rating. There is perhaps a greater chance that Topalov will not accept the nomination and will not participate. You may know from Topalov's biography and the history of the 2006 World Championship and enmity with Kramnik and the Russian Chess Federation that Topalov does not think very highly of Russia and the Russian Chess Federation. He is Bulgarian, and there's a little bit of animosity there as a former Soviet republic. But in addition, Topalov does not consider it very favorable to play in Moscow. So he's gone on record, and his manager has also gone on record to say that Topalov is going to wait to get the contract and then consider it, and he may accept it, he may not. Now, if Topalov does not accept his spot in the candidates tournament, we go to the person who finished 3rd in the Grand Prix cycle. I talked about that in the Caruana lecture. Does anybody remember who it was? was Dmitry Yakovenko, a Russian player. So Warren and I were having fun with a little conspiracy theory first before our presentation today, saying, what if, the Russian Chess Federation tries to do something to disenfranchise Topalov, to convince him not to accept the nomination so that they get Yakovenko. And anyway, probably not going to happen, but it's fun to think about. So it looks like the field is set. Now, so March 10th through the 30th, and just to remind you, next month we're going to look, that's December, we're going to look at Levon Aronian. In January, we're going to look at either Anish, we're going to look at who gets in by rating, probably Giri or Topalov, and then February we'll look at our remaining candidate, and that'll gear us up for the candidates tournament in March. So we are going to finish on time, and I am happy about that, despite Thanksgiving and Christmas trying to throw us off. So let's get back to Karjakin. Sergey Karjakin was born in 1990. Oh, I put 35. He's not 35. He's 25 years old. Typo on my part. Excuse me. Sergey Karjakin was born in Simferopol, which you may know is part of the Crimean Peninsula. Now, when he was born there, the Crimean Peninsula was part of the Ukraine, and it was part of the Ukraine until a little over a year ago, when the residents of the Crimean Peninsula had a referendum and voted to affiliate themselves with the Russian Federation. So at the moment, Ukraine considers the Crimean Peninsula to be an autonomous republic, and Russia considers the Crimean Peninsula to be a region of Russia. So there is a territorial dispute there. There was a referendum and the majority voted, but international arbiters have talked about the fairness of the elections, and I'm not going to get into a political science discussion, but the point is Karjakin is from a region of the Ukraine with tight relations with Russia, and perhaps in an area that's felt kind of torn between Russia and Ukraine. And this is going to make a lot more sense later when we talk about Karjakin's affiliation, his FIDE affiliation, in the country that he plays for. So Karjakin learned chess at the age of 5. He had very supportive parents. His mother is Tatiana, his father is Alexander. He has, I know of at least one brother. He may have some more. And, for as much as someone whose entire childhood is pretty much devoted to chess, as we'll see, he spent a lot of time becoming as good as he did. He tried to have a fairly normal childhood. So even though, a lot of time was spent traveling to tournaments and playing in tournaments and coaching and training and club play and this, that, and the other, he still took some time to dance. This was actually after a tournament. They had a little, they transformed one of the playing halls into a dance hall, and there he goes. He's playing with, or he's dancing with one of his compatriots that he's known for years and years. So Karjakin, as much as anybody could expect, had a fairly normal childhood. It just happened to be dominated by chess. He grew up playing in Simferopol and in Kiev, and he played club chess there. They had a very strong club with good teachers, at least supposedly good teachers. And he was able to avail himself of the expertise of all those around him. You may know that there are some other very strong Ukrainian chess players, Ponomaryov, Elyanov, Vasily Ivanchuk. They have some very strong GMs and super GMs in the Ukraine, and Karjakin, to a certain extent, follows in their footsteps. But at the same time, he has blazed his own trail for certain. He's done things at an age that literally no one else in the history of chess has done. And to give you an idea of how good he was quite early in his life, let's look at a couple of early games. Remember, he was born in 1990. So the first game we're going to show you comes from 2002, when Karjakin was 12 years old. And in fact, at this exact tournament, he got his third grandmaster norm. So, and he had a FIDE rating after this tournament of like 25-30-ish. So he actually became a grandmaster right after this tournament. So this is a significant one to show. The second one we're going to show is a match, or is one game from a match played against Kostyniuk in 2013 or 2003, when Both of them are quite young, but Karjakin, you can imagine, was about 13. And I'll tell you, you'll see the games from this, but I'll tell you the results of that match afterwards. So, as always, for the commentary, I'll turn it over to Warren.
So Karjakin is kind of similar to Carlsen in that his style is pretty universal. He can play really sharp chess, he can play really positional chess, and we'll see good examples of both. Now, this first game is a great example of his ability to play with the initiative. This is a really sweet game. All right, so let's get right into it. So we start off with a Scotch, and now Queen H4. Now, as you can imagine, Queen H4 is objectively not a very good try. I'm actually not sure how old Malenin was at the time of this game, but I'd imagine he was just trying to trick the young Karjakin because, its theoretical status is not very high. But you will see it from time to time where people trying to catch people out of theory, right? The tricky thing, of course, is that White's E4 pawn is under attack. And it's not altogether easy to defend it because we can't move our bishop because we move the knight. And if we play knight c3 as Karjakin does, then bishop b4 attacks the pawn yet again. But Karjakin, even at the age of 12, obviously had probably studied this before because he played really precisely. So bishop e2. So in response to Black's early queen's order, he just develops. Now, Black played knight f6. By the way, you can take this pawn, but it's very risky because White will play knight b5. And it's not easy to defend the c7 pawn, right? For example, bishop a5 is not possible because of what?
Do it anyway, then take the queen.
Exactly. White can just take because if the bishop were to take the knight, then the knight's no longer pinned, right? And so Black would be forced to play king d8. So it's not going to be a fun middle game with their king on d8. But to be fair, this might be relatively better than what Black did. Black, at knight f6, I looked at ChessBase, and White scores about 83% here. So, yeah, Black was not lucky to survive with the skin very often. So castles, take, and now this nice in-between move. So this targets g7, and White can't take this pawn, but now White continues to get tempos. Of course, we're not going to trade queens. So queen a4. So why not just say bishop d4? That would save the bishop with check, right? But what's wrong with that?
Lose your queen.
Yeah, White could just play king h1, and Black has a problem because queen h5 loses the queen to knight g7. And queen g6, we have a problem with either knight d6 or just knight takes d4. Right? Both look pretty strong. So this would not be good for Black. So queen a4, and we just take.
Why would knight d6 be a problem?
Oh, going back. Okay, so bishop d4, king h1. Just a discovered attack on the queen.
Oh.
Yeah, the bishop, you lose the queen for 2 pieces.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
So queen a4 takes. Now Black has a problem with this g7 square. Castles looks like it defends it quite well. But unfortunately for Black, White's initiative doesn't stop. White's a play. White has an absolutely beautiful move here.
How about knight h6 check to open up the...
Knight h6 is a good idea. Not quite precise, though. It's the right idea, though. So which set of squares are weak on Black's king side?
Which set of squares?
Well, the black squares are, because
Yes.
White has that bishop, which is really...
Yeah, Black is missing a dark squared bishop. The dark squares are weak around Black's king.
Take g7?
Exactly. Yeah. That's the most logical move. So dark squares are weak, so just remove a dark square defender. Of course, tactically, you got to calculate the follow-up, too. So king takes. Now White has another sweet move. Now this one is really hard to find.
It isn't just queen d2, is it?
No. No.
No.
It can't be that bad.
You know, if queen d2, black has time to maneuver the queen back over. You have no time for moves like that.
Blocking. What about F4?
Well, F4 may allow you to do some kind of rook lift, but it's slow and it also blocks this bishop.
Thinking, right? And it doesn't matter. I was thinking more of the queen, but the queen's covered. The white squares are covered.
Mm-hmm. Check. It's beautiful. So, by the way, let's first see what happens if black takes a bishop. Then we'll go back and see what happens if he doesn't. So he takes, and white's idea was queen d2. And black has a problem because if you go back, then check, we pick up the knight with check, and then how do we finish off here?
Go to h6.
Right idea.
Right.
But if queen h6, then f5.
Oh wait. Queen f5.
Nope.
Did you try F4 this time and get the rook into it?
That might win, but white has way simpler. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, f4, I don't see any defense for black.
No, that's probably
right. But you have a very forcing continuation.
Queen g4 or g5 rather.
And then king h8.
King h8, and then queen f5. No wait, it's covered. Queen.
So if you ever try that, the queen can swing over to defend. You're on the right track, though.
Golly, my brain is not working this evening.
It'll probably seem really obvious once you see the next two moves. So I'll give you the first move, and maybe it'll help you find the next one. You can threaten two different mates in this position.
Oh, queen h6.
Exactly.
Of course. And the rook is hanging.
So it didn't work before because the king was on g8, where it defended the rook. So now black cannot defend both mates on h7 and f8.
I've never seen that mate.
It's a common tactical sequence in these positions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's mate. And if you don't block otherwise, that's just here. I mean, of course, technically the best move is to check, and then, mate comes, right? Technically it's a mate in 4, not a mate in 3. But okay, so unfortunately that would lose for black. So that's white's idea. Before we go on to the rest, so since that's so awful, why not king g8? This move isn't too hard to find. White's definitely not trying to win the rook.
Now do you play a 4? No.
That's probably good because, again, to be honest, I don't really see a great defense, but you have simpler. Yeah. Now, white can just play queen d2 here. The threat of queen g5 is pretty hard to stop. You can play queen h4, but then you give white the piece back. And yes, black is not getting checkmated immediately, but it will happen soon.
Yeah, you can't defend.
White can play f4 followed by rook f3. It's not look easy to stop. So maybe that's better, but it's still equally hopeless. But in the game, black decided to take the bishop and then go forward. Okay. Now, how do we continue?
H3?
H3 is a little bit too much prophylaxis. Yeah, you can play it. You don't need preparation here.
Yep.
Black takes. You can go ahead and take it. And now black has a problem because this threat of bishop e2 and the queen. Black ignores it in the hope of getting a couple pieces for the queen. So say if bishop e2 here, black would somewhat be happy because then maybe knight e5 and 2 pieces for the queen. You're still lost, but you can play. But Karjakin found stronger. Is there any way you can threaten a mate in 1? Does that threaten mate in 1?
Oh wait, rook f6.
Yes.
Oh.
Threatening rook h6 or queen h6, right?
Yep.
Black has to guard the h6 square. And now we check on e2. Now we just take. And black just resigned at this point because If you play king takes, rook g1 is death. Take on g5 after. And of course, king h4 is hardly better because rook h6, followed by rook d1 as well, right? So, horrific, right? But really beautiful. I mean, it looked like White's attack almost came out of nowhere. I mean, Black castled, and then just a few moves, they came in a fury, and it was over. Beautiful attack. I mean, really, I can hardly compare this to any game I've seen. For a 12-year-old to find this is pretty remarkable.
Can you flip through the first couple moves on that with that h4 coming
It somewhat reminds me of Naka versus the Dew.
Yeah, it is very similar.
out?
Just
Develops.
opening crush.
Yeah.
Yeah, Karjakin played this game pretty much perfectly. I wouldn't say Karjakin played a single bad move in this game. It's just amazing. I mean, if you look this up with a computer or a database, every single white move is the first choice. Pretty sick for a 12-year-old, right? Yeah, just a beautiful game. Knight takes g7, just incredible.
Yeah, that's pretty neat.
Not very often you get to play a double piece sacrifice. For your third GM norm, that's pretty good style. So this was pretty, but this was not his only display of tactical prowess. Well, you can look at the games more in your own free time.
What's amazing is you look at that position up there, and it's like he still has a knight and the rook, and he's got the queen still kind of covering that horizontal across. So it's and there's only really two pieces it seems like are in play that are aimed at that thing, and he's still able to bring them out and pummel them. It's good, pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. So we're gonna skip forward. The opening of this game wasn't really too much of a concern, but the tactic he played to finish off Kosteniuk is amazing. So let's go forward. Let's see. Forward 58. Okay. So in this position, the young Karjakin found an absolutely beautiful tactical sequence here. So if you're watching from home, this would be a good moment to pause and think for a little bit. Here, I'll give you guys a couple minutes to see if you can play like Karjakin. Like a 13-year-old Karjakin.
What about queen takes a6?
Excellent. Okay, so let's see your follow-up. So queen takes a6, rook takes c1. Okay, rook takes c1, rook takes a6. And then queen e8.
And then bishop takes e5.
Bishop gets
Nope.
Wow.
This is not a brief tactic. You're on the right track, though. But bishop takes d5 is not...
Maybe just rook takes e8. Rook takes queen on e8. Oh, no, wait. Yeah.
Okay, rook takes and then king f7.
And then bishop takes.
So then you lose a rook on e8.
Is there still a rook round?
There's one final move in that position you have to find before you play this tactical sequence. And Karjakin somehow found it. This is the value in practicing your visualization, by the way. So in that position, after rook takes king f7, white has a beautiful move. Just try to visualize that position.
So after queen takes a6, can't black just trade rooks and
Exactly.
move his other rook out of the way?
Move the other rook to
Well,
where?
I mean, after you say the first move is queen takes a6, is that right? Can't black just take the rook on c1, and then after, because that's check, he takes the rook back, and then just move the rook on a8?
To like f8?
Yeah.
Oh, black can, but then bishop takes d5, followed by queen takes, followed by queen c4. And the rook ending with two connected passed pawns is pretty much a trivial one.
Rook to a8.
I'm very impressed.
Oh, nice.
So let's go through the moves. So the first point, by the way, is that black has to take on c1 because otherwise you take on c8 and then d5 with decisive advantage. So obviously rook takes first, and then take. But now check, queen here, rook takes. Now, not bishop takes because of here. And this endgame may look tempting because you can trap black's rook. And normally this is good, but the black king gets there in time. And now all of a sudden white's lost, right? Black will take on b7 followed by d5, right? So this does not work. And yeah, just to go back earlier to someone made a point about not taking the queen. So if instead of this position, black played a move like, for example, rook f8, white could just take and then play queen c4, and it's essentially a trivial win in the rook and pawn ending with these two connected passers. All right. So going back to the game, we have this amazing move, rook a8. So cool.
Wow.
If the black rook takes, then we have this fork and then take on a8.
Oh, no. How can you see this?
One of the coolest tactical sequences I've ever seen, I'd say. Seriously. Yeah.
Problem is I didn't get the A6 move in. I didn't even start right.
But yeah, I wanted you guys to calculate that instead of moving along move by move. Because if you play that sequence as white, you have to see rook a8. Because if you go back to this position, if you don't see rook a8, it's tough luck, So you can't play the queen takes a6 unless you see all this. But yeah, just a beautiful move. Rook a8. That's so satisfying to look at.
And there's nothing black can do. He's
Exactly. If you play king e6 or something, you just take.
Yeah, and you lose.
Yeah.
Free rook.
Game over.
Yeah, so of course. Yeah, you can't move the rook off either. You finally can't.
Rook has nowhere to go.
You didn't become a candidate for nothing.
Exactly. I mean, he was 13. I mean, what a sick tactic, I've never seen any tactic like this before. It's pretty amazing. All right, any questions on this or the previous game? All right.
I said that I would tell you the result of that match. Karjakin won 2 wins, 4 draws, no losses in that match with Kosteniuk. So a pretty convincing performance. And as Warren talks about, Karjakin was known when he was very young for his tactics and his calculation. So I mentioned in the blurb about this lecture that Karjakin is the youngest grandmaster ever. So I have some numbers there for you. Karjakin was an international master at 11. He was a grandmaster at 12 years, 7 months, 0 days. And you see that is 7 months, almost 8 months faster than the person in second place, and 8 months faster than Carlsen as well, and faster than anybody else in history. You may remember that Bobby Fischer was the youngest grandmaster ever when he was, when he earned his GM norms at 15, and then Judith Polgar beat Fischer's record, and then and then you notice now Judith Polgar is not even in the top 24. There have been many, many people who have come along and achieved their GM norms faster than Judith Polgar or Fischer. And, people chalk this up to many reasons. Some people say that there is rating inflation and ELO inflation, and that, GM doesn't mean as much anymore. You may have heard some discussion of whether they should create a new GM category, because we unofficially call super GM super GM. So, maybe GM isn't all it used to be. That aside, the point remains that Karjakin received his GM title earlier than anyone in the history of chess. This was 12, 13 years ago. It is 14 years ago. It's not been topped to this day. And I don't know anyone who's close. I'm not keeping an active eye on that, but I don't know of anybody who is close. Maybe a Wonder Liang or something. Anyway, very, very early age, he got his grandmaster title, and it's a record that stays to this day. That said, and if you look at a rating graph of kind of the top GMs of this current generation, you'll see Karjakin in red, and you'll see that for a while he was crushing Magnus Carlsen. There was a time where he was rated 200 points higher than Magnus Carlsen. You'll see that Magnus Carlsen caught up and then surpassed him around the age of 16 or so. But you see that Karjakin was certainly dominant. This big white region in between shows just how much earlier he was to reach some of these milestones. Incidentally, there is one player who is progressing faster than Carlsen did, and it's Wei Yi from China, who is still 16 years old and who was on an absolute tear in the World Chess Cup. And Wei Yi his progress is currently outpacing that of Karjakin, Magnus Carlsen, and any other GM you could name of the current generation. So that's certainly a talent to watch. That said, if you look at this average line, this dotted or dashed line here that shows the average of all these ratings, you'll see that Karjakin essentially kind of hit the average at around the age of, I guess this is about 21, 22 years old. He kind of hit the average, and now he's just slightly below average of the trajectories of all these other players' careers. You see Carlsen has extended a pretty huge lead here. For as phenomenal as his progress is, it's kind of averaged out in the end, and it's not as distinctive as it once was. That said, he still holds the record. Warren talked about Karjakin's gift with tactics. What you may not know is that in 2002, the Ukrainian player Ruslan Ponomaryov was contending for the FIDE World Championship. And 12-year-old IM Sergey Karjakin was his official second. Now, Ponomaryov was 18, so maybe it shouldn't surprise you. You know, he was the youngest FIDE World Champion. FIDE, not PCA. There's still a divided title here. He was the youngest FIDE World Champion ever. And so it may not surprise you that Sergey Karjakin was a second at the tender age of 12. And you know, this is Karjakin right here in the blue T-shirt. That's, imagine, you know, you go to the FIDE World Championship and that's your second. It's kind of weird. But Ponomaryov selected Karjakin because of his tactical ability. This was certainly a harbinger of the trajectory of Karjakin's career. I mean, Ponomaryov in part chose him because as an international master, he was rising in a meteoric fashion. And maybe it was easier for him to, you know, maybe he got along better with him than, say, Ulyanov or Ivanchuk. I'm not sure. You know, I'm not sure what his rationale was in choosing Karjakin. But to my knowledge, there's never been a second in a major tournament as young as Sergey Karjakin was. I find that, you know, just mind-boggling that he was 12 years old. So his career rose very quickly, but he hit a bit of a plateau. And the plateau was caused in part by his access to instruction and his home country's chess federation and their practices. So actually he took the very surprising step in 2009 to switch federations. And he switched from Ukraine to Russia. So you see a quote at the very bottom where Alexander Karjakin, his father, is saying that not only Sergey wanted to switch nationalities, but they all did, and so they all moved to Moscow, the whole family did, and that they applied for Russian citizenship, and Karjakin applied to represent Russia in FIDE. And there are a number of different reasons for this. One, I mentioned that as part of the Crimean Peninsula, Karjakin certainly spoke Russian, probably as his first language. They have a lot of cultural ties to Russia, first of all. Second of all, he saw that his chess trajectory wasn't going in the direction that he wanted, and that he wasn't getting the support, and he says that in 2009, that he wanted in Ukraine. So let me give you a couple of examples. First, he didn't feel that that Ukraine had access to the top coaches. He thought that they were in Russia, and he's right. Second, Ukraine's chess federation is somewhat disorganized. He cited an example in a couple of years where his rating was not even published in the FIDE bulletin because Ukraine had not paid their FIDE membership dues. That's a little embarrassing when you don't even have a public... I mean, it didn't prevent him from playing in tournaments, but you can understand that he was somewhat embarrassed by his country's federation. So he decided to switch in 2009, and in July of 2009, it became official. By the way, his shirt has Putin on it, and I'm fortunate enough to have some students who speak fluent Russian, and it says, my student's translation, "We don't abandon our own." I don't know if that's a thing for Crimean nationalism, Russian nationalism or what, but there you go. It's supposedly his favorite T-shirt. So he moved to Moscow and worked with two grandmasters there. I'll get to those in a moment. And became a Russian citizen, and he kind of was the predecessor for federation changes upcoming. We've talked about Fabiano Caruana, whose decision to change his federation back to the United States raised quite a few eyebrows, and I got into the financial side of that. We talked about Wesley So, who after winning Millionaire Chess in 2014 decided to use part of his winnings to switch his affiliation to the United States from the Philippines. They were number 2 and 3 in the past kind of 10 years to do that. Karjakin was the first. He kind of was the trailblazer in that sense. And I've said on a couple of occasions that I think that's going to happen in the future, that money will play a pretty big role in kind of breaking down country affiliations. And I think that Karjakin, Caruana, and So exemplify that. So I said that he moved to work with a couple of trainers. They are Yuri Dohoyen, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly, and Alexander Motylev. Dohoyen was Garry Kasparov's second and Garry Kasparov's coach for many, many years. And it's funny, Karjakin makes the point that while Kasparov was training Magnus Carlsen, Kasparov's old coach was training him. So that said, he doesn't feel like he has this kind of he doesn't feel like he really has a rivalry with Magnus Carlsen. I'll get to that in a moment. But the point is that Karjakin moved to Moscow in part because he wanted to make sure that he got the training that was necessary for him to advance. And you may have saw the quote on the last slide, which said, "I've begun to work with well-known trainers. This was my main condition for the move. I said, if you want me to move, then give me the best trainers." So we get the feeling there that it was a negotiation, that there was an ongoing negotiation between Karjakin and his family and the Russian Chess Federation. And the Russian Chess Federation at least allocated some funding or helped him arrange sponsorship so that he could afford all the things that he wanted to afford. Ukraine is going through some dire financial times. You know, they're not even paying their FIDE dues on time. In Russia, he gets access to coaches, sponsorship, and some other stuff that I will get to in a bit. So Motylev is a coach of the Russian national team, and he's rated around 2650 FIDE, so that makes him a very strong GM by pretty much any measure. And as we mentioned, Dohoyen was Kasparov's coach for many years and is second at several tournaments. So his credentials are impeccable as well. And it just goes to show that Karjakin's belief that he would have access to better coaches in Russia is borne out by the fact that that they have a much more robust coaching system and development program in Russia. So that was certainly the biggest factor in his decision. There are a couple of other factors. Politically, obviously, is one, and sponsorship, which we'll get to in a bit. So Karjakin moved. You know, he had to live in kind of a small apartment in Moscow and had to get used to living in a large metropolis, you know, with traffic jams and subway systems. I think Simferopol is a city of about 350,000 people, and Moscow is several million. So obviously that was a bit of an adjustment. But he's made the adjustment. He, you know, obviously shows a lot of pride in his Russian nationality. And he has certainly benefited from that move. You know, there was a plateau there for a while where he was having trouble making progress. But in the past couple of years, his rating has certainly improved. And he's now solidified himself in the top 10 in the world. And his rating has fluctuated. I think he's been as high as number maybe 3 or 4 in the world. And he's had some very strong tournament performances, which, again, we'll get to. But before we do that, let's look at a few more games. First, we'll look at Karjakin versus Radjabov, Timur Radjabov. This was from the European Individual Championship in 2005. So Karjakin's at the tender age of 15. And then we'll look at a more recent game, Karjakin versus one of our candidates, Levin Aronian. This was played in the city of Men in the Basque region of Spain in 2013. And again, for that analysis, I will turn it over to Warren.
So this next game we're going to look at is a good example of Karjakin's positional side. He was not just one-dimensional. Okay, and this game should bring back memories from a previous lecture, and I'll show you what I mean when I get to that point. All right. So we had a Sicilian. And you know what variation this is? Sveshnikov.
Sveshnikov.
Or Chelyabin, it's kind of depending who you're talking to, I guess. So all pretty standard. So the main premise of this opening is that white is happy because he's gotten this beautiful d5 square for the knight, and black is happy because he has the two bishops, right? Still debated pretty hotly today. All right, c3. Idea of this move is since that knight is estranged on the side of the board, bring it via c2 and maybe e3 or b4 to fight for that d5 square, right? So bishop g5. This covers the e3 square that I just mentioned. Knight back. Knight e7. Now already Radjabov plays kind of an unusual move. By far the most common move here is just for black to castle. One of black's thematic ideas in this position is to play f5. Try to fight for that center that way. So castling is a big part of that. But he set it on this knight e7 move. And h4, bishop h6, now a4. So this a4 break is really common. Now, I said this might remind you of a game. Just briefly, I'm going to show you the start of Kasparov versus Shirov from 1994. So we went over this game before, and it's just to show you the opening of this one. Slightly different move order, but we also ended up in a Sveshnikov. And in this game, we also saw this a4 break that Kasparov did. And do you guys recall this game at all? It had a rather remarkable novelty happen. And it was in this position where lightning struck.
Rook took d7.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
With this beautiful positional exchange sacrifice. With a dominant knight on d5. Unable to be challenged by a light squared bishop on b7. So this game happened in 1994. Now let's go back to this Karjakin game. So we see this a4 break. Black takes. But instead of taking right away, Karjakin plays knight b4. Pretty accurate because he wants to maintain the knight on d5. He doesn't want a queen there. So if black were to take, he would just take back with the knight. And now he's also intending maybe to take on e7 and then come to d5 with tempo. Just a very nice move. But you might think it's a problem because now bishop d7, and it may seem like white sacrificed the pawn in a4. But given that game we saw with Kasparov against Shirov, but what do you think Karjakin played here? The queen covers the b6.
Rook takes a4.
Exactly. Yeah.
He gets a pawn for it. Too.
Yeah.
It's not much of a sacrifice.
Yeah, this is why knowledge of some of those classic games can be very useful, right? If you're familiar with this Kasparov-Shirov game, you think, well, the light squared bishop is an important piece for black, so giving up the rook for it would not be unprecedented, right? So we have a similar position again where white's down the exchange, but black has no way at all to challenge that dominant knight, and the light squares are just weak all over for black. Much the same. So let's see how Karjakin converts it. Now what's interesting, I think, is if you look at this position with the computer will say, oh, maybe a slight edge for white, like maybe 2/10 of a pawn. But every move you make going forward, white gains a little bit every move. Yeah, I think it's just one aspect where computers obviously need to improve. It seems to clearly underestimate white's long-term compensation here. So black was trying to save the a6 pawn, but it wouldn't help anyway. White got this past b pawn anyway. Now second pawn falls. Black's trying to open up another line on the king side, but it's too slow. Queen c7 is nasty, threatening rook a7 with a lethal battery on the 7th rank. So unfortunately, black is going to have to suggest an exchange, but the endgame doesn't provide much relief.
It's almost like white had two pieces for a rook. Because that bishop was...
Exactly.
The bishop was worthless.
This bishop on f8 leaves much to be desired, right?
It never could do anything.
Yeah, part of the problem in a position like this is just that it's hard to improve black's position. I mean, I don't see any obvious white targets. I don't see any excellent squares for the black bishop, even if you could put it somewhere. And the rooks just don't have great lines. I mean, this is just a great example of that. Black's trying to get his own counterplay, but it's just too slow. Now white picks the right moment to trade rooks, and now black can't stop the passer. So black would have to sacrifice a rook, and then white would have just an extra piece. So I think a really nice game. I mean, much like the Kasparov game, it seemed like black had no counterplay. Just really, really cool positional exchange sacrifice. So I mean, this is just a good example of Karjakin's feel for strategic side. He wasn't just all tactics. So any questions about this one? All right.
So that was a positional?
Oh yeah, because there was nothing immediate white had in terms of getting the material back, or there wasn't some ferocious attack on the king. It was just the dominant knight on d5 would slowly escort the b-pawn down, and black had no counterplay. I'd also suggest you review that Kasparov game with Shirov for 94 too. Both are just great games. Okay. So now let's look at his game with Aronian. Now you saw that picture Lucas showed. So this was actually played at a unique event where they played 2 games simultaneously. So this is one of those 2 games that they were playing simultaneously.
Yeah, they alternated colors, so they played white and black at the same time.
Yeah. Kind of a unique concept. I don't think it's been repeated, but it was interesting. I remember this tournament.
Yeah, the tournament was sponsored by a company called Mind Games, so go figure.
So it starts out with a Ruy Lopez. Now d3, slightly unusual, right? Rook e1 is most common. b5. By the way, white had a very concrete threat because since the e4 pawn's covered, now bishop takes c6 followed by knight takes pawn is a very real threat. So that's why black plays b5. Now d6. Now black makes his own quote-unquote threat because if white were to play something like h3, then knight a5 would win the light squared bishop, right? And of course, we don't want to lose our precious bishops. So a3, right? Again, kind of a sideline because c3 is the most popular move here, and it's more in line in general with the Ruy. But a3 is, of course, playable. And now Aronian play another slightly unusual move in bishop e6. Now, I found almost 300 games in the database in this position, and bishop e6 was only played in less than 20 games. Not a very popular move then or since, actually.
And even not usual.
I think the most common move is actually just castling, right? Yeah. Black usually follows up with knight a5 and c5, kind of typical with classical Ruy Lopez stuff. For the most part, black seems to ask white why white did not go for c3, d4. That's the problem with playing d3 is you're always going to lose the tempo if you go for that. We're going back to the game. Bishop e6 is interesting. It's really kind of double-edged. Sergey Karjakin played the most kind of principled move, just giving black double d-pawns. Now, it may not seem like much to give black with double pawns, and they can be useful, but the downside is long-term, and we'll see Karjakin exploit this pretty nicely.
Can you undouble with d5 stuff?
Well, yeah, black can consider that, but the problem with ever playing d5 is, like in this position, say black played d5, white could play like rook e1, and then white's already threatening moves like he takes d5, and taking at e4 doesn't help you undouble. So playing d5 doesn't ever necessarily look like a great way to help your pawn structure. That's the problem that black has here is it's not easy to get rid of these pawns. Although he does have an opportunity later, and we'll see in a moment. So Aronian's trying to free up his c-pawn so he can gain some space on the queen side. Kind of a typical Ruy Lopez idea. Usually we see the knight go to a5, and it usually goes there because it gets a tempo on the light squared bishop. But of course here there's no bishop, so why go to a5? And now d4. And now actually was black's opportunity to undouble these pawns with taking. Although it's not perfect, and the downside here is that white has much more space. Black has these pawns on e6 and d6, and white on e4 and d4. So black could have undoubled them, but white still has a clear advantage, I think. But Aronian went for knight f7. just maintaining that pawn center. And the good thing is that this pawn center restricts white's pieces, but the downside is that it's going to require constant attention for defense. So it's not easy to exploit, but Karjakin does a good job. So c4, this is the first step in a nice idea. So first of all, this stops black from pushing the pawn further and maybe establishing a stronghold on d3. And secondly, white prepares a better diagonal for this bishop, because we could develop it along this diagonal, but it's not necessarily going to have a great target. He'd rather go to b2, where it would attack e5. So very nice idea. So immediately puts black under pressure. And although it may not look like black's really under too much pressure here, the problem is the inability for him to move his pieces to more active positions, right? White has a pretty small but constant advantage. Moving the king closer to the center for the endgame. And if we put knight on d3, it'll attack c5 and e5. So it's even better on that square. I think it's kind of a nice position. I mean, this black knight has no good squares, and all three of black's minor pieces are just defending a pawn.
And the rooks also are.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how passive Aronian's position looks. Black can get some semblance of activity, but you'll see it's pretty much only temporary. So Aronian tries to open the position up because if you just sit there, you're going to die. But unfortunately, it doesn't quite work out so well. So for tactical reasons, of course, black can't win a pawn because of this a3 fa diagonal, right? This white bishop can always make a pin. And of course, that c4 pawn is not going to run away from white. And black still has those doubled e pawns. I love Karjakin's patience here, just improving his position with h4 and f3, f3 shoring up e4, h4 taking away g5 from the knight. Just really nice moves. He recognized that he did not need to be in a hurry. Finally, black tries to force white to do something before he marches the king up, but doesn't work out so well. Bishop here. So now white wants to keep the bishop and take on c4. So Aronian's trying to prod Karjakin into giving up the bishop, but of course that's not going to happen easily. Plays a nice tactical shot here and knight takes c4. So the first point is that if you take the bishop, knight b6 just wins in exchange, right? Take the rook on a4 after. But it is an interesting sequence. So first Aronian saves this rook. Now he takes the bishop. White has a point because of these two weak knights here. So now knight b6. And right now black has two knights for the rook, but unfortunately, now we have this skewer back here. So pretty interesting. But it turns out black does have an interesting try here. So he played rook a3 and checked a few times, and we'll see how Karjakin responds to that. But Aronian did have kind of a cool possibility that I wonder if he did consider. He could have played this move, rook a1.
What? Oh.
So the idea is now if we take this rook, then there's no skewer, right? If we check back, black's fine, right? So it may not look too obvious what to do. You can take both knights, but then what's going on here? Material is still even. Now I looked at this, and apparently white has a winning king and pawn ending after take, and now g4. Yeah, so if black takes, we have these 2 against 1, and we can make a passer. And if black doesn't, we still win. We can take, and then play f4.
King position's better.
Exactly. So white somehow ends up with a winning king and pawn ending. Say king d6, we push, and white has this winning king and pawn ending.
Wow.
Yeah, so pretty deep. I wonder if Karjakin calculated all that out. I'm not sure. But regardless, yeah, I saw this rook a1 move because at first the computer liked it, but after it saw that winning king and pawn ending, I guess it didn't. But anyway, he elected to give a few checks, but it didn't work out. White trades rooks, and he's up the exchange of this endgame. it's not too hard to win for white. And now this pawn queens, right?
Yeah.
So a really nice game. I mean, Aronian didn't seem like he ever had a chance even in this game. Just really nice positional game. The only problem he had in this position was basically double D pawns, but it was enough for Karjakin to win with. So again, a good example of Karjakin, being able to play well in all kinds of different positions. So any questions about this game? All right.
Sergey Karjakin switched affiliations to Russia because of access to coaches, perhaps cultural, political reasons, and also the role of money. You may remember in the Caruana lecture, I talked about the fact that Fabiano Caruana was getting a stipend from the Italian Chess Federation, something like 80,000 euros per year, and reportedly the USA, and by USA I really mean Rex Sinkefield, offered Caruana 100,000 euros, which would be like $110,000 per year as a stipend. And of course, that's, last time I checked, greater than 80,000 euros. So that's part of the reason why Caruana switched back to U.S. Chess Federation. Part of the reason, not the only reason. Watch that lecture for an in-depth treatment of all of his rationale. Karjakin also switched to Russia because of access to sponsorship dollars. His sponsor is a financial services company named Alpari, and basically all Karjakin does is wears their logo, goes to a couple of corporate events, I guess, per year or so, mentions them from time to time in his interviews, and in exchange, he gets a pretty nice salary. And, some of the top players have these deals. Nakamura has an endorsement deal with Red Bull. Carlsen actually has several different endorsement deals, including like a clothing line and a couple of others. So Karjakin is not, unique in this respect. And he's also not unique in the respect that he can go do some events at corporations and get lots of money. I mean, Magnus Carlsen does this. He goes and plays simul's at Google and Microsoft, and even Gary Kasparov, he charges upwards of $50,000 to go speak at company retreats and such as that. So it's not abnormal for a chess player to leverage their celebrity, or what little celebrity chess players have, into financial backing. I'm glad he's able to do it. I mean, it pales in comparison to what someone like, a retired football player or soccer player or retired politician, they can get far more in terms of their honorarium. Heck, a couple of years ago, I looked at getting the astronomer, the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson to come speak, and even Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is an astrophysicist, commands upwards of $40,000 as an appearance fee. As a scientist, that's pretty crazy. Neil Gaiman, the author who wrote Coraline, America Gods, etc., he charges upwards of $50,000 to appear at a public event. So, in that sense, I don't begrudge him the ability to do that. And he said it was for a couple of reasons. He needed money to pay for coaching. He needed money to pay for travel and entry fees. Obviously, the Russian Chess Federation helps pay entry fees to some tournaments, but, there are travel arrangements and things like that. And he also mentioned, and I thought this was really interesting, he talked about the fact that a lot of grandmasters who have financial backing use that money for supercomputers. This was new to me. I'd never heard of this. He says, and the figure he threw out was $50,000, that some GMs have invested $50,000 in a computer to basically run an engine to help them with their preparation. Now, this was, unique. Not unique, obviously, several other players do this, but I hadn't heard this before. It was really interesting. Obviously, I'd considered coaching. I'd considered travel. I'd considered tournament entries, all of that, but I never considered that a chess player might want to spend a bunch of money on equipment. Karjakin talks about that. So he presumably has bought himself a nice computer to help in his preparation and analysis. That's kind of strange that, I know about gamers and their obsession with the latest and greatest, graphics card and whatever, but that chess players would also invest lots of money into having a powerful computer to run an engine, that is interesting. So I mentioned that Karjakin has had several notable tournament successes, including winning Norway Chess 2013, Norway Chess 2014, he defended his title. And you can see that, this is against some of the world's top players, Topalov, Caruana, this guy you may have heard of named Magnus Carlsen. A lot of strong players are there, and Karjakin wins it 2 years in a row. Pretty darn impressive. And then, of course, we know that he won the FIDE World Cup this year. You can see Kirislania Yumazov to his side, and Peter Svidler looking less than impressed with his bag of swag. At least he didn't get the basket of flowers. Karjakin at that tournament, I think he won somewhere in the order of 100,000 euros. I mean, that's pretty big money. And obviously he says that was the greatest result of his life to this point. He's young, 25 years old. He's got a lot of chess left. Speaking of young, this is something I often like to talk about players' personal lives a bit. Karjakin's a bit reserved, but he actually got married the first time at age 19, which to me is super young. That's scary young. But I'm sure he was mature beyond his years. From playing chess and competing in adult tournaments from the age of 9 or 10 onwards. He married a women's international master from Ukraine at age 19. They were married about 2.5 years, and then they divorced. And then a couple years later, in 2014, he married a Russian woman, and I have her picture there, Ms. Kamalova. I haven't seen confirmation of this, but supposedly they're expecting their first child. If their first child hasn't already been born, which may have actually happened, she was expecting during the World Cup. I'm certain that it'll be soon. So he's starting a family. Well, starting a family with children. He talks about that he feels like he has experience because he has a brother that's much younger than he is, something like 17 years younger, 20 years younger. And he's had some experience helping to raise his younger brother. So he talks about the fact that now he feels prepared to be a father. But the point remains, as with Svidler and Anand and a lot of other players we've looked at, although not Nakamura, even though he has a long-term girlfriend, and not Caruana, Karjakin has a family, and obviously that impacts his ability to participate in various tournaments. Incidentally, his current wife is not a chess player. His first wife was a women's international master. His current wife does not have a FIDE ranking. She's not played in any rated tournaments that I could find, but she has been an arbiter in several tournaments. So I think she's either a national or international arbiter. So perhaps they met through chess as well. Okay, in the Svidler lecture, I showed how Svidler looked head-to-head against the other likely candidates. We can do the same thing with Karjakin. The outlook is not so good. First, I must say that in the previous candidate cycle, where Anand won the right to re-challenge for his world championship, Karjakin finished second. So we can't ignore that. That is a great result. In the last candidates tournament, he finished second. I don't mean to denigrate that in any way, shape, or form, but his record against the other candidates is fairly weak. He has a winning record against Svidler, although their last match showed that it could go either way. He has a dominant record against Giri. But everyone else, Nakamura is fairly close, and it's kind of hard to say because they go way back. They go back to like 2001, 2002 when they started playing each other. But it's hard to say, how Karjakin would fare against the other candidates. On paper, I can't pick him as the favorite. We've been wrong about a lot of things in these presentations. I once predicted, and I was almost proved wrong that Karjakin would beat Svidler, and it almost didn't come to pass. And I predicted that China would bid to host the candidates tournament, and that didn't happen. Although we did list Armenia as a possibility, so we at least covered that base. I've been wrong a couple of times here, and I could be proven wrong again. But on paper, I don't favor Karjakin in his game against, or in his candidates tournament against the other candidates. We'll see. They're playing in Moscow. That's his home turf. He lives in Moscow. He is certainly going to be comfortable. He knows a lot of these players very well, played some of them very many times. And, he has history, for example, with Topalov and And he's a history with Nakamura and a history with Svidler. They run into each other in a lot of Russian championships and such. So he knows some of these players very well. And you see he's very prone to draws with some players like Caruana and even Aronian to a lesser extent, and Carlsen. But on paper, outlook not so good. Okay, he has beaten Carlsen before. And for our final game of the night, let's look when that happened. It was in 2012 in the Tata Steel tournament. And Karjakin doesn't consider Carlsen to be his rival. And this is interesting. I told you that Nakamura doesn't really see it that way, and Svidler doesn't really see it that way. And a lot of the players don't consider themselves as real rivals of Carlsen, not to denigrate Carlsen's ability, quite the contrary, but they don't see him as, they don't put this mental block and associate it with him. But the media loves to make a big deal out of it, particularly because Carlsen in Russian is spelled with a K. And people see this K versus K part 2 thing, of course, with Karpov and Kasparov, and then Karjakin versus Carlsen. So the media likes to make a big deal out of a potential rivalry there. He doesn't see it that way. But to see the outcome of this game, let's look at our 5th game. And incidentally, with Karjakin having the black pieces, and as requested online, we'll show it from Black's perspective.
So again, we're going to see a game where Karjakin doesn't really beat Carlsen because of a tactical slugfest, but a nice strategical point. Okay, so let's get to it.
Flip it to the black perspective.
Oh yeah, whoops. Let me flip it for everyone. All right. So it starts out as a Queen's Indian, and Carlsen plays the Petrosian variation against this. Now, A3 was a favorite of Kasparov's, so you wonder who taught Carlsen this. Yeah, I'm sure this was an A3 move was an influence of Kasparov. Nowadays, really, it's not as popular because Black has found some nice ways to combat it, and Karjakin plays a really nice way. So H6 immediately. Bishop H4 is possible for White, but Carlsen just takes, which is fine. This knight A6 move is a little bit unusual, but it's kind of a nice idea. The knight actually won't be so badly placed on C7, where it might consider going to E6. They put pressure on D4. So it's kind of a nice idea. And now Carlsen makes what is probably his first mistake. There aren't many games in the database from here. It looks like knight A6 is something of a kind of a new idea. But I probably would have preferred something like Queen A4 here, followed by Rook FD1. At least Stockfish kind of likes this idea. Either threatening to open up this sensor with D takes C, or if Black plays C4, then it would close the center for the 2 bishops that Black has. So I would probably have preferred this. But anyway, Carlsen plays 95 move, and Karjakin finds a nice way to take advantage of it. So take, and then take. So we end up in this pretty double-edged position where Black has this isolated D-pawn, but it's also passed. That's going to cause Carlsen some trouble. And now D4. So the position is getting really sharp, and Carlsen already makes his first mistake here, or second one. Knight E4 puts White in a tough spot. Knight B5 looks like it was definitely necessary here. Now I guess Carlsen might not have liked it because of Bishop A6, but after A4, it seems like White's doing okay here. I don't see anything particularly ominous that Black has here. So this was probably his last chance to stay in the game.
No, it doesn't do anything.
Well, it might be possible, yeah, but I think White's doing okay here. I didn't see anything immediately. Okay. But he played 94, and here Karjakin plays a really nice idea. So it might be tempting here to maybe take on d3, get the knight for the bishop, and then maybe play something like queen d5. But it's not that great. After white stops the mate threat, say like rook e2, it's not going to be easy to improve black's position from here. Since the pawn on d4 is blockaded, I don't see anything obvious for black. But Karjakin finds a really nice idea. He takes the bishop instead. And it's a great idea to free that d-pawn. Basically, by getting rid of the bishop instead of the knight, the knight is a far better blockader of pawns than a bishop. So removing that really helps black. And now this d3 move. So this was a nice positional game, but there's always tactics behind strategy. So bishop takes a8 does not really work here, because after the sequence d2, forking the rooks. Now if we save the bishop, black takes on e1, and then we fork the rook and queen after. So a beautiful tactical point to this idea. Pretty cool. So the rook is taboo, so he plays rook up to stop queen d4 and the fork. Rook c8. Another nice counterattack. Now a5 to maintain that knight there, at least for now. And this prepares the b3 square for the knight, so he can force the pawn forward. So now white has a problem, because the bishop's going to be forced away from this diagonal. Of course, if we play bishop h3 or something, knight e4 is just a killer. So white has no choice but to bite the bullet and take the pawn, but unfortunately, there's way too much on this d file. White's going to lose material here. So although he did save the piece, he had to sacrifice 2 pawns to save it. And now Karjakin converts nicely. With the 2 extra pawns, it's hardly really a challenge for Karjakin. And then Carlsen finally resigned. After rook f5, the king will be forced away from the g2 pawn, and with the 3 passers, there's no counterplay for white. But the main beat of this game is back in that middle game. This really nice sequence gets this past d pawn. Hits black a lot of counterplay. Then this bishop takes e4 move is just really pretty. That d3, d2 idea. So even Carlsen, by the way, back in 2013, 2014, that's when he reached his peak rating. He was almost 2,900. So this was in a period where Carlsen was playing pretty much the best chess of his life. I mean, although Carlsen's played fine this year, it doesn't come close to how he performed in 2013 and 14. So any questions on this game? So unlike Nakamura, at least Karjakin can say he's beaten Carlsen in a classic game.
So as you might imagine, particularly in the English language, it's somewhat difficult to find sources on Karjakin. His English is not that great. His first wife spoke English fluently, but I don't know that his second wife does. So he has to work through his manager to, and we have to rely on translators to translate some interviews, because he's been interviewed many times in Russian, but we rely on translators to translate that into English. And there are no books, at least in English, written about Karjakin. So for this, there are DVD series and stuff like that on his games, but not on his biography. So for this, I relied on chessandtranslation.com, which actually does a nice job of taking articles posted in Russian and translating at least the juicy tidbits into English, and then good old ChessBase for a couple of the interviews they've done, I think through Karjakin's manager, and then chessgames.com, obviously, for some of the games and analysis and records that we've looked at tonight. So again, it's the information we could draw from. I mean, there are some areas that I wish I could have explored, but I couldn't find pertinent information. I would have liked to have known, for example, what his training regimen was from the ages of, say, 5 to 11, how frequently he was playing chess, if he had any notable coaches. If I know he ventured outside of Ukraine a couple times to play in the World U12 Championship, which he won. But I couldn't find a lot about his early life. It was a lot easier to find information about, GM through the present, so 12 to 25. I was able to fill in more blanks there. But unfortunately, he posts a lot. He even has a Twitter handle and a website, but, a lot of his tweets that are in English are pretty basic. They don't really, tweets aren't really conducive to explaining your life story, with that character limit. And so it wasn't like Svidler where I could rely on a lot of his own answers, and it wasn't like Nakamura where I could find a book about him. So because this is an area of exploration, it would be nice to have a good book on Karjakin, although I can understand why we'd want to wait till he's a little further along in his career. So those were the sources I relied on. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them as best I can. Questions? Okay, we stuck to about the time that we wanted to do, so turn off the attack. You're welcome.